It was a snowy winter morning, and the girl was busy preparing food for the upcoming dinner. The smell of a juicy steak filled the kitchen as it sizzled on the griddle. She was just about to flip it when an angry woman suddenly burst in, slapping the skillet in frustration. "Why isn't the food ready yet?" she demanded. Without waiting for an answer, she tasted a piece of the meat, spitting it out immediately. "It's too salty," she shouted. The cook, calm and emotionless, looked at her without flinching. "You expect people to eat this? Especially today of all days," the woman continued, her voice rising with irritation. "Maybe I'll replace you with someone who knows what they're doing. Maybe a man." The girl sighed heavily, turning away. Then, with a strange smile, she replied, "Unfortunately, I can't call on my family's employees to do work outside their duties." The woman frowned, shocked by the girl's insolence, her eyes fixed on her. Meanwhile, another voice echoed through the house. A young girl stormed into the room, shouting loudly. "Where's the item I asked you to find?" she demanded. The cook, slightly surprised but unfazed, wiped her hands and handed over a package. But the young girl snatched it from her angrily, tearing it open only to find it wasn't what she had asked for. "What is this?" she shouted, her anger boiling over. The cook, still calm, sighed and looked at the ceiling. "I saw something like it on Instagram a few days ago," she said nonchalantly. "It's kind of popular." "I know." The young girl, now visibly frustrated, held onto the package tightly, refusing to let go. "Don't you dare touch it," she snapped. "Next time, get me what I asked for." As tension simmered, the woman ordered the cook to throw the package away and get some food delivered instead. The cook, on her way out, shouted back that it wasn't her problem, and the woman could handle it herself. After the shouting match, the girl returned to cooking, humming quietly to herself. But soon the woman reappeared, her tones sharp. "You're free this weekend. We're going to the hospital." The girl blinked in surprise. "Why? What's wrong, Mum?" The woman's face twisted with anger. "Why are you pretending? You know exactly what's wrong. It's been over a year since you got married and still no children." She spoke as if it were obvious. "It's your fault. You need to get smart and figure this out. If you can't, I'll do it for you." The girl stood silent, her breath caught in her chest. After a moment, she smiled slyly. "We've already discussed it with Saya. We'll go to the hospital together." Her mother's eyes widened, grinding her teeth in frustration. Clearly annoyed, she sighed deeply and changed the subject, bringing up the vacant position at the girl's company. Then Brandon knew he was being preyed. The girl smiled again and casually mentioned that her stepfather wanted to work there, but Sok had already taken care of it. Just then a man's voice chimed in, offering to help, but the woman quickly cut him off. If my daughter had been as loving as Ura, she wouldn't need help solving everything. She then turned to her daughter, asking, "What's so great about you anyway?" At that very moment, there was a knock on the door. The guests had arrived. The woman's demeanor instantly changed. She greeted them with a bright smile, welcoming them into her home. The guests marveled at the house, praising its beauty. "Has the house gone up by 200 million?" one asked. The woman laughed and said it wasn't that expensive yet, leading them inside as the girl served plates of food. The guests complimented her, calling her beautiful beyond words, and thanked her for the lovely meal. Soon, laughter and conversation filled the room as they enjoyed the feast. After the meal, the girl stepped out for a moment. Her mother called after her, asking her to bring more meat, but the girl was already heading somewhere. When her mother asked where she was going, the girl didn't respond, lost in her own thoughts. A moment later, the girl was gone. The woman, growing tense, started to follow her daughter, but stopped when she saw the girl glowing with joy as she re-entered the room. The guests fell silent, watching in awe. The girl approached her mother with a smile, taking her hand. "Thank you, Mum, for always being so kind to me," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. "I'm so lucky to have you." Her mother stood frozen, stunned by her words. Then, with another sweet smile, the girl added, "Sok just called. He wants me to meet him soon." With that, she left, leaving her mother speechless. Outside, in the empty parking lot, the girl sat in her car, the smile fading from her face. She remembered her mother's words, harsh and unfeeling. "Even if today is the day you were born, it's just another ordinary day." The girl hit the steering wheel in frustration, yelling, "This isn't right. It shouldn't be like this." Suddenly, her phone buzzed. Messages from her husband Suk had come in, asking how her day was going. She unlocked her phone to see 4 messages and a missed call from him. Ben began texting her husband. In the first message, he apologized for not being available earlier. The second message explained that he was still delayed in a meeting, but 3 hours later he would finally be free. A small smile crept across U's face at the thought of finally seeing her lover. She exhaled deeply, thinking about everything happening, then glanced back at her phone. 2 hours and 37 minutes had passed. Enduring time with her husband's family, she needed to be at the hotel soon. After responding to Sok, U set her phone down and started the car. As she drove, her thoughts drifted to memories of an evening with her husband. She had been telling Sok that she couldn't sleep in the same bed as another person. He simply replied, "I know." U continued, explaining that maybe she could sleep in the same room, but never in the same bed. Sok smiled, repeating that he understood. He then added, "You won't have a normal family life with me, will you?" Be confused by the question, U hesitated. Sok's smile widened as he said, "I don't care about anything as long as I have you." Her eyes had sparkled at his words, leaving her speechless. Suddenly, Ura snapped back to reality. She stood in a store, staring blankly at the floor. The cashier's voice startled her, asking if she had placed an order under Suk's name. She quickly confirmed, then left the store, realizing she was running late. Rushing down the street, she heard voices around the corner. As she approached, she realized one of them was Suk. What was he doing here? Then she saw Ura standing next to him. Yu immediately turned away, listening intently to their conversation. Sok was telling Ura that she was the only one he loved, that he didn't need Yu. At those words, U's world crumbled. She froze, barely processing what Sok was saying next, that he would file for divorce soon and be with Ura. U couldn't bear to hear any more. The box she had been carrying slipped from her hands, the cake inside tumbling to the ground. Sok and Ura turned sharply at the noise, and there stood Ura, her face blank and emotionless. Ura immediately rushed to her, calling out and begging her not to jump to conclusions, but Yu already knew. There was nothing left to save. She smiled bitterly, turning away from them. Ignoring their pleas, she began to walk quickly, wanting to escape them, their betrayal ringing in her ears. As Ura chased after her, Yu's steps quickened, her anger growing. Ura finally grabbed her arm, forcing her to stop. "Please, just listen," Ura begged, for what felt like the 100th time. Furious, Yu asked one simple question. "Did you know that Sok was in love with you?" Ura couldn't answer, her silence revealing the truth. Ura couldn't answer. Then why did you keep hanging around him? Guilt flooded Ura's face. She confessed that Seok was kind and understanding, and she had assumed her feelings were fleeting. Grabbing Yu's hand, she urged her to talk to Seok, that he could change his mind. Ura gritted her teeth, realizing how selfish Ura truly was. Sok chimed in, attempting to defend himself, but U shot him a venomous look. She ripped her hand free from Ura's grasp and walked away, no longer willing to listen to them. Her pace quickened until she was nearly running, lost in a blur of emotion. She couldn't hear or see anything around her, including the crosswalk timer ticking down. A speeding car bowed through the intersection, and by the time U noticed, it was too late. The car's headlights glared like demon eyes in the dark, and in an instant, Yu's body was airborne. Her heel remained on the ground, leaving a red trail behind. Ura screamed, horrified by the sight. Sok instinctively tried to shield her eyes, but the damage had already been done. Tears welled in Yu's eyes as she hung in the air, thinking of one thing. Why had she ever believed Sok could change? In her final moments, everything became painfully clear, but it was too late. Yu died on the very day she had wished she wouldn't. The story shifts back to the past, to an orphanage on a night when it was snowing heavily. Yu had been abandoned as an infant, left crying in front of the door. She had gone through many adoptions and rejections, but one night, a pair of hands lifted her from the darkness. She was adopted by a wealthy family, and for a time, things seemed to improve. But soon after, her adoptive mother, Jumin, passed away, leaving a deep void in Yu's life. What followed was even worse. Her adoptive father, Shanghai, brought home another girl, the same age as Yu. This girl was Ura, who was overjoyed at the thought of having a sister. U had been diligently practicing piano, playing in large concert halls, pouring all her energy into her performances. But no matter how hard she worked, she could never outshine Ura, who excelled effortlessly in everything she did. Yu watched from the sidelines, always overshadowed by her sister, even in their school years. While her parents praised Ura for her academic success, Ura stood trembling as she looked at her own grade sheet. From the moment Ura was born, she had been surrounded by misfortune, always overlooked. She remembered walking down the school corridor, minding her own business, only to open her locker and have a pile of ruined books and notebooks fall out. The students laughed at her, mocking her for being adopted. She knew exactly who had spread the rumors. Yu looked across the room and spotted Yakan, who was laughing with the others, her voice echoing in the corridor. The pain of betrayal hit hard. Her own sister, enjoying herself while Yu stood isolated. At home, Yu tried to reassure herself that things would eventually be okay. She could get through it. But just as she was finding some peace, a noise outside her door caught her attention. Startled, she stepped out of her room to investigate, but the hallway was empty. On the floor lay several boxes and a letter. Curious, she picked up the letter and opened one of the boxes. Inside was a record player. Confused but intrigued, Yu unfolded the note. It was from someone who had overheard her mentioning her love for old things. Embarrassed by the gesture, he explained that he had recorded some of his favorite old songs for her, hoping she would enjoy them. At the end of the letter, he wished her a happy birthday. The sentiment overwhelmed Yu. She quietly turned on the record player and let the music wash over her. Tears welled up in her eyes. It was the first time anyone had done something so thoughtful for her. Immediately afterwards, she told her friends. Years later, those memories remained vivid. Yu had never planned to marry Suk, but the daughter of the president of WJ Retail marrying the son of his driver felt like a fairy tale. Despite her parents' decision, Yu still felt like an outsider, and Suk's affection seemed to be the only genuine part of her life. She remembered his words, how he had once promised to try as long as they were together. But now, those same words felt hollow, tearing at her heart. Her thoughts snapped back to the present. She was still standing in front of that speeding car. In a blink, Yu was airborne, her heel left behind on the ground. The echoes of Sok's betrayal, the man who swore to her sister Ura that she was the only one he loved, rang in her ears. Her world had been stolen from her, piece by piece. And just like that, Yu's hard life came to a tragic end. But then, something strange happened. A voice called to her, faint at first, but growing louder. Yu's eyes shot open. She was alive. Confused, she found herself back in her bed, with Ura standing over her, asking how she was feeling. "What?" Yu gasped. "Wasn't she dead?" Slowly, she sat up, disoriented. Ura smiled and reminded her that today was the dress fitting for her wedding. She must look her best. Ura's heart raced. Was this a dream? She hurried to the mirror, staring at her reflection, trying to make sense of it. Grabbing her phone, she checked the date. July 19th. But that couldn't be right. Wasn't it supposed to be November 20th? She blinked, staring at the strange marking on her wrist. Panic set in. Could it be that she had somehow travelled back in time? Determined to make the most of this second chance, Yu went to her dress fitting, trying to play along. The seamstress tightened the wedding gown, and as Yu stood in front of the mirror, she sighed, holding back her emotions. The sales clerk asked if everything was all right, and Yu reassured her it was. But when she saw Sok, looking enchanted by how beautiful she looked, her smile faded. In a fit of rage, she grabbed a bouquet and swung it at him, hitting him squarely on the head. Shocked, Sok asked what was going on, but Yu only smiled bitterly. Grabbing a pen from Seok's pocket, Yu tore the wedding dress right down the front. The saleswoman was aghast. Yu declared that this was her marriage dissolution gift to Seok, then casually handed over her credit card to pay for the now ruined dress. As she left the shop, Yu knew that this was her turning point. She would reclaim everything that had been taken from her. She would reclaim everything that had been taken from her. Later, Yu met with a friend in a small, cozy coffee shop. Her friend, puzzled by Yu's decision to meet dog Ayo, asked why she had called for this impromptu meeting. Yu casually mentioned that she had broken up with Sok, shocking her friend. As they talked, Yu explained that Sok had fallen for Yura, leaving her no choice but to move on. Her friend's astonishment was evident, but Yu only laughed. The conversation turned to dog Aoyu. The heir to a wealthy family but known for his reckless behavior and obsession with gaming. Yu's friend was skeptical, but Yu seemed unfazed. She had a plan now, a vision for her future that didn't involve Seok or anyone else who had betrayed her. The past was behind her, and this new life was hers to shape. At an upscale event 2 days later, Yu found herself in the company of Dog Ayo, the younger son of the Sogging group, a man with a powerful presence and a well-tailored suit. He seemed like the perfect candidate for marriage, but as Yu scanned him, she recognized the same self-centered traits she had seen in Sog. Yet this time, Yu was different, no longer the naive girl from her past life, but someone who knew exactly what she wanted. Finally, Yu sat across from the guy her sister was interested in. After a brief conversation, Dogok tapped the table with a card, drawing Yu's gaze. He casually told her they should meet at the hotel later. Yu was stunned by his audacity and laughed to herself. Though she'd heard rumours that Dogok was arrogant, she hadn't expected him to be worse than those whispers. Dogok continued, saying he had also heard rumours about her. He understood she wasn't one of the easy ones. He smirked, remarking that Yu was actually quite the entertaining conversationalist. Immediately, Uppal joined in, rosing from the sofa. Front showed up convinced Uppal's math skills and completed their task. Uppel grinned and said it was just a meeting. Uppel raised an eyebrow and questioned whether he always had to be so direct. Uppel grinned and said it wasn't so bad, after all. Yu stared at him. I figured this was a test the moment we met, she said coolly. I'm not a fan of guys who flash a room key as their first move. Dogok, taken aback, tried to recover. He muttered that trusting his future to the woman who made him use that key on their first meeting didn't seem like a terrible idea. He met Yu's judgmental gaze, but couldn't read her expression. Yu stood up. I'm sorry, but I don't think I fit into the future you're imagining, she said. James Dogok, unfazed, wished her luck. Yu sighed deeply, deciding it was time to head home. Just as she turned to leave, she heard a familiar voice behind her. She spun around to see Yura standing there, with Seok at her side. The sight of them together made Yu's stomach churn. The reality of her memories hit her all at once. She froze. Yu knew she had to act, to show her sister that she was stronger. Without thinking, she turned back to Dogok, staring him down. Only one round for this test, right? At that moment, Yura noticed her sister in the cafe, her eyes widening as she saw Yu sitting with Dogok. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. Meanwhile, Dogok was confused by Yu's cryptic statement. One round? What do you mean? He asked. Before Yura could approach, Yura leaned forward, grabbed Dogok by the collar, and kissed him. His eyes shot wide open in shock. Across the cafe, Yura and Sok stood frozen, utterly bewildered by what they were witnessing. Yura's face twisted from one of joy to one of disbelief and anger. Dogok, still processing the situation, suddenly realized that he was enjoying it. He reached out, cupping Yu's face as he deepened the kiss. Yu's eyes fluttered open, surprised by his reaction, but she didn't pull away. Until she finally remembered why she had started this in the first place. She broke away abruptly, wiping her lips in embarrassment, avoiding his gaze. Dogok blinked, still dazed, trying to comprehend why Yu had stopped. Just then, Yura marched over, her expression stiff. What are you doing here, Mr. Dogok So? She stammered. Sok greeted Dogok, clearly just as surprised. Yura forced a smile and said it was quite the coincidence to run into Yu and Dogok here. Yu, turning to face Yu, simply asked what she was doing there with Sok. Before Yura could answer, Yura turned back to Dogok and smiled. Dinner tonight? She asked, teasingly handing him the room card. Dogok smirked. I think that sounds like a good idea. Yura and Sok exchanged confused glances as they watched Yu and Dogok continue their strange flirtation. Dogok took the card from Yu, and they both smiled at each other, leaving Yura fuming. The scene shifted to the hotel room. Dogok explained that it wasn't a suite, just a business room. He sighed and said, a business room. The number of women that have ever made it this far before. The number of... Yu interrupted, apologizing for the earlier kiss. She told him he was free to report it to Yura if he wanted to. Dogok chuckled, wiping his lips. What are you talking about? He asked. It wouldn't be as fun if we played by the rules. He leaned back, asking why Yu really wanted to meet him. Yu paused, then answered, because of the wedding. Dogok looked puzzled. Is there any other reason for a blind date? Yura turned away. Yura seems to like you, she said quietly. She turned back. Dogok raised an eyebrow. Is that why you wanted to marry me? Jean met her own reflection in the window. At first I thought it was about you, but now I'm thinking about starting a company. She turned back to face him, her eyes hard. I know about your grandfather's condition for investing. The condition is marriage. Once you get married, he'll let you start a venture. Dogok stared at her, processing her words in silence. Yu, sensing his hesitation, asked, What do you think about that? Dogok smiled, surprised by how well she knew his circumstances. Interesting, he muttered, his eyes narrowing. You talk like you know the future. Yu's phone suddenly vibrated, breaking the tension. Dogok glanced at it. Yu checked the caller. Yura. She immediately rejected the call. Dogok frowned. Why didn't you answer? Before she could respond, another call came in. It was Sok this time. Yu rejected it again and shrugged. Doesn't matter. Yu set her phone down and asked Dogok, What are your plans for tonight? She glanced up. If you're free, we could spend the evening together. Then she felt his weight on her shoulder. Dogok's eyes widened, caught off guard. Wait, you saying we should sleep together? How? He burst out laughing, unable to contain himself. Jude stood there, puzzled, realizing too late the double meaning of her words. Flustered, she covered her face with her hand. Dogok, still chuckling, leaned forward, asking, What exactly are you after, are you? A fake marriage, perhaps? I don't think I ask for much. He stared at her curiously. And what do I get out of this deal? The girl didn't know how to respond, and Dogok kept pressing her, asking what if he chose Yi over her. What was the difference? He asked her to prove that she was worth it, or maybe she could charm him enough for him to fall in love with her. U silently stared into his eyes, trying to think of something to say. However, she found herself amused by how similar Dogok was to her. It was entertaining. After a pause, U silently stood up and walked to the wine cabinet, deciding that wine might help them figure things out. She opened a bottle, poured a glass, and handed it to Dogok, remarking that if she were him, she would have bought a Nova Games instead of investing in hotel keys. Dogok was surprised by her comment, as he hadn't realized her interest in his business. He asked if she heard that from his manager, to which Yu responded by asking if he was the type of person who immediately ran to a supervisor when special issues came up. Dogok smiled, intrigued by her thoughts. Yu shouted. They continued drinking, and after a while the bottle was empty. U, tired, fell asleep in bed. Later she stirred, turning over and opening her eyes, only to be startled to find Dogok sleeping beside her. Even in his sleep he looked handsome. But then she noticed something. Her lipstick mark on his neck. Shocked and horrified, she started piecing together the events of the night. She had found Dogok's lip mark. She remembered them drinking together, her removing her coat and then throwing herself at him, saying she wanted to sleep. The memory made her blush. Deciding she needed to leave before Dogok woke up, she tiptoed around the room. But when Dogok shifted in his sleep, she jumped in fright, thinking he was awake. However, he remained asleep, much to her relief. Smiling at how handsome he looked even now, she left some money on the table to cover the cleaning costs and slipped out. As Yu drove away, her expression showed no sign of joy. Eventually, she arrived at her destination, her grandfather's hospital room. Upon entering, she saw him hooked up to an IV. He was surprised to see her and immediately took her hand, apologizing for everything. He told her she was his only granddaughter, repeating the apology over and over, with tears in his eyes. Yu felt a deep guilt. 3 months earlier, her grandfather had passed his entire inheritance to Ura, and Ura knew she needed to verify his words. She glanced around the room and saw his toothbrush, deciding to take it with her. As she reached for it, the door opened and Ura entered, addressing their grandfather. Ura smiled warmly at him, calling herself his granddaughter, and then started tending to him. Ura turned to Yu, remarking that she lacked respect for her elders and scolded her for not answering the phone yesterday. Yu sighed but pulled herself together, smiling confidently. She told her mother she was on a date last night. Her mother's eyes widened in shock as she asked if the date was with Dogok from the sogging group. Yu laughed and confirmed it, though she wondered how her mother knew. Ura had mentioned it earlier. Yu smiled slyly, saying there would be good news soon. Meanwhile, at Dogok's office, a meeting was underway about the sales of the new game Golden Eye, which had increased by 22% in the first quarter. Despite the discussion, Dogok's mind wasn't on sales. He was still thinking about Yu. Her actions from the night before had puzzled him, especially the money she left behind with a note to cover cleaning and breakfast. As he reflected on her strange behavior, Dogok couldn't help but remember Yu's tipsy state the previous night. She had been talking, and whenever he turned away, she would yell at him, asking if he was paying attention. Rather than being annoyed, Dogok found it funny. Yu had summed up her life in a monologue, laughing at the absurdity of it all. Then, out of nowhere, she asked Dogok if he could see memories. Dogok, staring at the floor, said he could. Yu had averted her gaze, confessing that there wasn't a single moment in her life that had truly hooked her. She asked Dogok how that could be, but he didn't have an answer for her. Frustrated, Yu had sighed and declared that this time it had to be different. Then, to Dogok's surprise, Yu suddenly got up, announcing she was going to bed. Dogok considered. Dogok was caught off guard by the abrupt change in conversation, especially when Yu started undressing. He tensed up, asking what she was doing. Feeling embarrassed, he tried to stop her from undressing, but she protested, screaming at him not to touch her. Dogok was trying to calm her down when he realized she still had a dress on under her coat. Relieved, he tried to compose himself, but Yu, in her drunken state, tripped over a chair and fell toward him. In a split second, Dogok couldn't catch her, and they both ended up on the bed. Yu, already half asleep, pressed herself against him. Dogok was left bewildered, his heart racing. He realized how much he liked her being close, but was also embarrassed by the situation. After a while, Yu rolled over to the other side, giving Dogok a chance to finally stand up. As he looked down at the sleeping girl, Dogok noticed something strange. A license plate on her hands caught his eye. He recognized the inscription. Looking at her, he whispered to himself that he didn't want to remember certain moments from his past either. Stroking her hair, Dogok promised himself that this time, things would be different. The scene shifted back to Dogok's office. It was already 10 a.m., and he hadn't received any calls from Yu, despite her mention of the wedding the day before. Just then, an employee interrupted Dogok's thoughts, asking if he was thinking about work or something else. The employee handed Dogok a tablet, congratulating him. On the screen was a news story titled, "Tycoon So Good," featuring a picture of Dogok and Yu. Immediately he started scanning the article, asking if it was about the second son of Sun Group. The guy responded that this wasn't the most important news at the moment. He warned the director that because of the criticism and scandal, the company could suffer losses. Suddenly, Dogok noticed the author of the article. It was his favorite cousin, Su Jan-non. After turning off the tablet and handing it back, Dogok asked if his assistant had contacted the girl. The assistant confirmed that he had and leaned in to share something even more interesting. He had found out that Dogok and the girl had gone to the same elementary school. Dogok asked if this meant they had a close relationship. The assistant clarified that they didn't, as they hadn't gotten along during that time. Dogok sighed, recognizing this as typical of Su Janan, and immediately asked his assistant to bring the reporter to him. The assistant hesitated and nervously asked if Dogok was planning to sleep with another girl. These words amused Dogok, and a smile spread across his serious face. A moment later, he burst out laughing, leaving the assistant bewildered. Suddenly, Dogok stood up, grabbed his jacket and started walking out. The secretary, confused, asked where he was going. Dogok turned, smiling, and said he was running away. Just as he reached the door, his assistant's eyes widened in fear, realizing it was too late. Someone was already there. The woman stood behind Dogok and asked where he was going. Turning in horror, Dogok greeted her sweetly, asking if she had arrived already. The woman, growing suspicious, asked if Dogok was planning to get married. He nervously confirmed, avoiding eye contact. The woman, frustrated, reminded him that he always avoided looking her in the eye when she asked that. Dogok sighed and admitted that even his father didn't know about it. This revelation shocked the woman, who demanded to know more. Dogok turned to his secretary and asked him to explain his nickname. Surprised, the secretary quietly explained that Dogok was asexual, had no sex drive, and was impotent. The woman was taken aback, utterly shocked by what she was hearing. Dogok smiled, explaining that he had lived with this condition his whole life and had to prove it to people. The woman, still in disbelief, asked if this was why Dogok wanted to get married. Dogok, seemingly unbothered, asked her why she had married his father, even though he already had a wife. In a fit of frustration, the woman slapped him, calling him a rude child. Dogok, stunned, watched as the woman angrily walked towards the elevator. Before she could leave, Dogok grabbed her arm and turned her around. He confidently told her that he would reclaim his father's company and win back both his father's love and his grandfather's legacy. The woman, unsure whether to believe him, asked what he meant. Dogok smiled sweetly, assuring her that he would make it happen. The scene shifted to a beautiful beach. Yu was on the phone, being asked where she had disappeared to. She calmly replied that she was at the beach, which shocked the person on the other end, who exclaimed that she must be crazy. Yu then confirmed that she was going to marry Dogok Aio. The friend on the phone, laughing, asked why she should help her. Yu sighed, hinting that she knew about her friend's secret relationship, which made the friend spit out her coffee in shock. The friend, panicking, asked how Yu knew. Yu reassured her that she wasn't following her, but added that the guy she was seeing had a pregnant girlfriend. The friend, horrified, asked if this was true, but Yu tried to downplay the situation. As the conversation continued, Yu suddenly spotted someone and abruptly ended the call. "If you think I'm lying, try and act out the conversation." Dogok stood in front of her, having finally found the girl who had been on his mind. He asked why she had stayed by the sea, admitting that he hated the beach. Avoided the question, asking why he had been looking for her. Dogok explained that she hadn't answered his calls, and that he wanted to return the money she had left. Yu, confused, told him there was no need to return anything. Dogok sighed, explaining that it was unusual for someone to leave a note and run away. Yu, taken aback by his confidence, jokingly asked if he had run out of money. Dogok smiled and admitted that he had suffered a loss, a significant one. He then reminded her that she had mentioned the wedding first, and he intended to take full responsibility. Although Yu was speechless, Dogok smiled and declared that there would indeed be a wedding. He thanked her for the incident and emphasized that her time was running out. If she didn't act soon, her sister would be the one standing next to him. Yu tensed, not wanting that outcome, and told him she understood. Dogok then invited her to have a meal with him, repeating the request when she hesitated. Yu, still uneasy, tried to refuse, claiming that she had her reasons for not eating with others. Dogok laughed, saying not to worry and that he would go first. He reached into his pocket and held out 2 bills, asking her to apologize properly for the kisses, the leaked photos, and the note. Tearing up the bills, he insisted that they should eat together, calling it the first condition of their wedding. The scene then shifted to a cafe where Yu looked around, unimpressed. She asked Dogok why food was the first condition for the wedding. He explained that if he hadn't insisted, they wouldn't be sitting together like this. Yu, frustrated, stared at the table. Dogok teased her, asking if the convenience store food was good enough for someone so squeamish. Yu, still irritated, admitted that at least the convenience store food didn't require her to check the cooking process.